I want to welcome you to this edition of Crisis and Hope, YU Voices, in special partnership with the YU Honors Program. Crisis and Hope is a project that Center for Israel Studies, Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program for International Affairs, and the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies and Judaic Studies at YU, Madei HaYahadut. My name is Ronnie Perelis. I'm lucky enough to be a professor of Jewish history here at YU, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's event, a discussion of Every Last Breath, which is the latest book by our dear Joanne Jacobson. Joanne Jacobson is a Professor Emerita of English, a former dean, and former director of this esteemed honors program. So it's really great to have her. She'll be in conversation with Barbara Blatner, who is a professor of English here at Yeshiva College, an integral member of our intellectual community. And I'm really excited for this discussion. This series of talks, Crisis and Hope, was started with the belief that conversation that's nuanced, that's intimate, can get us beyond the headlines and the tweets and the partisanship that we're living through and the chaos, and that going to the past, thinking about the past in bringing that insight into the present, thinking about the arts and the way they can help us navigate our lives, is a worthy endeavor and a place that we should come together to join together and to think new thoughts and to share ideas. So it's my pleasure, without any further ado, to start this wonderful event. So thank you so much. And it's really very special to have Joanne back on campus. Her presence on campus since when I started here about 10 years ago was always calming, and you knew you can talk to her about anything, and she'd be honest and insightful and wise. And I'm really excited to hear about this book that I know is a labor of love. So without any further ado, thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Ronnie. It's really my pleasure to be back at YU. And in addition to thanking Ronnie and the Schneier Center, I want to also thank the Yeshiva College Honors Program, Professor Eliezer Schnall, for the initial invitation, and to my colleague and friend, Barbara Blatner, for taking the time to moderate this discussion. It's really a sweet occasion for me to work with everybody again. I guess I should say at the start, I hadn't intended to bring out a book on illness during a pandemic. It's not ideal in a number of ways. But as it turns out, I hope this book does speak to things that people are thinking about and feeling right now. I'm going to start today by reading it just in straight succession from sections of the book, Every Last Breath, and in the hopes of giving you a sense, all of you, of the book's key concerns, and also its structure, which moves back and forth between my mother's illness and my own. And after I read for a little over 10 minutes, Professor Blatner and I are going to talk about the book together for another 20 minutes-ish, and then we'll open up to Q&A from all of you. So,
if I can just mention, pardon me for interrupting, if anyone wants during the course of the presentation to send me, Eliezer Schnall, host, however exactly it's identified in your chat, you can send a question to me, and then during the Q&A, we'll be happy to address it.
Super, that's great. Looking forward to hearing from people also. So, goodbye, old clothes. My sister and I are helping our mother pare down the contents of her closets and her 8-drawer wooden dresser, getting her ready to move to a retirement home. My mother works slowly, hanger by hanger, holding up the knit jackets and the soft wool sweaters that she wears to synagogue, unfolding the brightly colored scarves that we've been buying for her birthdays and for Mother's Day. My mother gathers a bulky hand-knit sweater around her shoulders, and her voice fills with emotion. I love wearing this one. She lays out on her bed 4 red turtlenecks and 3 blue ones, then adds a stack of cardigans to the clothes that she intends to take with her. She has worn them all through years of bundling up for apple picking and for the last backyard barbecue of the season. for walking along the lake on the first still raw mornings of spring. Even for the snake, instinctual shedder of what's dear, the act of sloughing off can take a harsh toll. Beneath the molting layer, the new skin is raw, unready for touch, freshly spun over beating heart. While it's shedding, a snake's eyes grow cloudy and its vision dims as it focuses on the hard work of shaking free, starting from the head, rubbing loose the leathery mouth and the nose, finishing by gulping water to slake the big thirst it's worked up. Only after it heaves its old skin aside can the snake fully resume seeing and breathing. Wild, exhausting life, moving each passing year a little more slowly, each year a little more reluctant to let go of what sticks close, reluctant to release what matters. In April, my mother told me that what was making me sad was my own mortality. And by July, it turned out that she was right. I was rounding the corner on my 5th year of writing about my mother's chronic respiratory illness. And in a moment, without warning, I was facing the true fact that I could die before she did. My plan had been to follow my mother's illness in the present tense, so that I could draw closer to her while she was actually living end of life. I was hoping that by not waiting for the point when I could look back and read in reverse, I would create the potential for illumination. My mother has proved to be stubborn, sometimes hilariously so. When she had to move out of her apartment, she refused to relinquish her stockpile of plastic margarine containers and her collection of mock turtlenecks, including the stained ones that she pulled out of the donation pile, announcing that she would just wear those backward. Yet she has also proved to be miraculously adaptable. She has faced and accepted 24/7 oxygen supplements, and she continues to play ping pong with a 5-pound oxygen tank slung across her chest. So I have been learning from this writing project and even acquiring an unanticipated humility, the effect of standing in attentive proximity to the unadorned courage required to live and to breathe every long day. And then suddenly, late one summer afternoon, words began to drift out of my mouth on a trajectory of their own. It seemed at first like a stroke, though I was still me enough to weep at the thought of being carried on a stretcher at rush hour into an elevator crowded with my neighbors. Over the next days, I would become unrecognizable to myself, a person diagnosed with a potentially fatal blood disorder, scarred where the flesh was cut, and a tube for total plasma exchange jammed into my jugular vein. Are you in pain? A nurse asks on my first morning in the hospital. Pain changes everything. I'm glad to be able to answer no, not only because I am relieved to not be suffering, but also because I am not ready to see myself in the hurting bodies of the patients all around me. Day and night, I can't help overhearing from the other side of the curtain, doctors telling other human beings that their lives will never be the same. That's a hard load that you've given me, a roommate tells her young doctor. I'm not sure I know how to bear it. Would turning up the volume on my TV be disrespectful, or just the right signal to transmit over the airspace between us my recognition that listening to this conversation is wrong? Good morning, Miss Joanne, the mother of another roommate, a young woman whose excruciating sickle cell anemia has relapsed, greets me. Scratching my dirty hair, outrageously bound in a bright pink band to secure heavy tubing to my head, I am disbelieving when I catch sight of myself in the mirror. If Pebbles were hospitalized, I mentally title this image. Who am I now? One night, an aide wakes me at 3 a.m. and packs up my small stash of belongings while I wrap my arms around myself in the hospital never-nightness, determined not to cry. They are moving me to the oncology ward, where the staff is better equipped to deal with my rare condition. I pad through the halls, wrapped in a pair of flimsy, wrinkled gowns, exchanging stories about the hospital food with other patients in the lounge. I am one of them now. I wear the same uniform as they do. "Can you see anything inside?" his companions cried out to the archaeologist Howard Carter when he opened King Tut's tomb, secreted in the sands for 30 centuries. "Yes," Carter called back. "Wonderful things." 4 complete board games, 139 ebony, ivory, silver, and gold walking sticks, 50 linen garments, for the Egyptians believed that earthly or human affairs continued in the afterlife, were preserved in the airless, crowded rooms. I wonder what my mother would wish to take with her on such a journey beyond time. Surely she would hope to leave behind the damaged lungs that slowed her down in her 80s, though she has already lived so much longer than the boy king, dead at 19. Without a doubt, she would have her Scrabble board folded up and set beside her, the soft cotton socks still filled with worn tiles, the little wooden racks on which she'd sorted and resorted so many letters, made so many words. And she'd want to take the flowers she had gloriously preserved all her life, the light blue salvia that she'd grown and hung to dry in pipe cleanered bunches over the kitchen sink, the Queen Anne's lace that she'd collected on weekend walks in the country and gently sank one by one into finely sifted sand. When she drew them out, the fragile blossoms would be perfectly fixed, hovering forever at the grayish edge of pink. Wonderful things. Even today, when her movement must be frugal, her breath slowed, my mother seeks out her garden in the morning coolness. She carries a trowel and plastic bags from the grocery store that she saved to collect weeds and dead flowers. She pauses when she comes to the end of the path, assessing what has grown in the sun since the day before, and slowly circles her plantings. She does not think about dying, she tells me when I ask, nor does she think ahead many mornings beyond this one. My mother has no interest in death's deals, in giving up even a little of the time remaining to her in order to set aside beloved objects for a chanced afterlife, much less to furnish a lavish tomb, in sacrificing even for a moment the gift of now that she has been granted. She gently cups a low fresh flower, something that wasn't open last time she worked in this modest garden. Isn't this what we all dream of? The promise of forever starting over, the human means of making new life and even beauty still close at hand. Modern imaging plumbs the body's depths with radar, magnetism, radiation, reveals a whole world beneath the surface of the skin, the way things work and the things that can go wrong. Yet it also reminds us that the body remains a keeper of secrets. In remission, my blood disorder is invisible even under the most powerful of microscopes. During the year when it was slowly approaching, the clues it left confused us. The unsaying of aphasia, the scrambling of language with no explanation, words launching from my mouth like clumsy tumblers, sound blowing uselessly through the air. Even now, as I look back and remember, speech, that precious part of me, feels wounded. We like to think of illness as an anomaly, a wrong that we hope to right. Yet isn't it wellness that's the illusion, the false promise, the fragile, hovering butterfly, lightness outweighed by air, life as short as a season? We live in a world of disruption, migrating birds thrown fatally off course by urban lights and noise, the seas rising as glaciers melt. In Miami, salt water soaks suburban lawns, fish swim in low-lying parks. Pluto has been demoted from one of the 9 planets in the solar system that we see in the nighttime sky to a large rock orbiting the sun. To be ill is, yes, to be similarly called out of the world that we count on, the reality that we take for granted. But it is also to be called more deeply into the world, to be immersed in its messiness and its movement, its ability to surprise and its mystery. The areas of the brain that control our most human functions, speech, memory, feeling, are called by neurosurgeons eloquent, the most essential to avoid damaging as they cut. But illness too is the body's eloquence, its own insistent language, moving and truthful. Thank you.
Joanne, thank you so much. It's wonderful to hear you read. I think this is the second time I've heard you read. And I think you read different sections this time, but you gave us a real sense of the sweep of the book. And what you end with, illness too is the body's eloquence, is proven in the book again and again and again, very beautifully. And so I'm interested in all sorts of things in this book, how you connect your personal experience and your mother and your observations of your mother to larger cycles of life and change and loss. And I think it's very compelling that you were writing about your mother for about 5 years and staying in the present with her, and then your illness happened. And so you had a whole new narrative to figure out what to do with. And I almost see this book as embracing narratives. Very beautiful the way that works. So how did you figure out how to structure the book as you structure it? Maybe it changed. I'm sure it changed, but can you speak about that a little?
Of course. I mean, I don't think I originally started to write a book. I had originally begun with these essays as my mother was ill, and I realized I had something to say about that, not necessarily something I could say to my mother. And then I'd gone along and written, I don't know, 4 or 5 of those essays, and then suddenly, as I read, things changed for me. And I think what I really did was sort of pile up a bunch of essays and then try to see what I had. And with the help of a lot of helpful readers, I began to see that a dialogue between my mother and myself, my mother's illness and my illness, felt like that was the structure that made the most sense, that was the most meaningful, that brought us into engagement with one another. And I guess I should add, a lot of my work as an academic was about American autobiography. And I think the tradition of American autobiography, thinking back, say, to Benjamin Franklin and the Revolutionary period, was really a tradition in which there was one unified narrative, and that autobiography was really an act of looking back from one retrospective point and giving one's life a coherent shape. And that in keeping with Franklin's idea of sort of creating a new American persona that was individualistic, that was different from Europe in that human beings had control over their own destiny, that format followed that ideology, really. And I think one of the things I learned from illness was that can't work. For me, that was a format that couldn't work, that was at odds with what I experienced. And that also one of the things I'd experienced was something which, this may sound very simple and obvious, but it surely wasn't for me, that being a body was something that I had to take into account as part of the life that I lead. And certainly those early autobiographies in many ways were about reason and the head and human power, overtaking the sort of primitive claims of the body. And I think one of the things that I felt I had to come to terms with here was the fact that the body was really central to my experience now. And in fact, or let me put that differently, that I had to acknowledge I couldn't not acknowledge any longer the claims that the body had to who I was. So I think that those were the things that really shaped how I began thinking about going back and forth here.
It's so interesting to hear about the narratives of Franklin that were pretty linear and kind of inspired or informed by the ideology of the time and the belief. So in your book, the back and forth, the dialogue is really working, because you go back and forth between observing your mother. We see you loving your mother and communicating with her, and she's communicating with you and your sister as well, either by looks, by phrases, by her exuberance and wearing her oxygen. And there are wonderful images of her as not wanting to look at what is ahead, which is very, very potent. And then the kind of break into your own illness, and you let us find the way that these two narratives intermingle. You're not kind of pointing things out, but they are really talking to each other. So the snake metaphor, which you know that I love, which completely blew me away, because I'm very interested in snakes, but I did not know that they became kind of incapacitated while they were going through the shedding of the skin, and that I think you said that their sight dims. And so for me, it's just I was stunned by that reading the book, as you know, and I find it to be like a gorgeous, striking metaphor of how when we are going through these things in our bodies, which we don't know until we do, that we cannot see, and it's just gorgeous. And where did that come from for you? I mean, it comes in near the beginning, and it comes in the goodbye section, when you're talking about your mother shedding her own skins.
Well, I think for me, I often found as a writer that, and I guess this perhaps also rubs up against what I said about the ideology of Franklin. For me, the writing I feel most happy with often comes out of not starting with an idea, but with recognizing in a memory or a scene something, I'll use your word, potent, something powerful, something that I need to come to terms with, and kind of going back into that and writing it and seeing where it takes me. And I think over the course of writing this book, I began to feel that a lot of the most potent correspondences to what I felt myself going through as a sick person, and what I felt watching my mother as a sick person. And by the way, I want to say at the start, this is an illness that's in remission now, and we know how to deal with it, and I'm not frightened of it anymore. But I think from the start, writing about my mother, I kind of recognized in the cycles of the natural world. I thought a lot about the monarch butterfly, which had been a big part of my growing up. Every year, in the fall, I mean, the monarchs are in trouble now. But the cyclical shape that we recognize in animal life is not a shape that we always recognize in our own lives. And I think particularly chronic illnesses, illnesses which resist linear narrative, in part by refusing closure, refusing to see that they're moving towards healing and ending. I mean, they certainly frustrate medical professionals in that way also. I began to feel that my partners in that conversation were really in the natural world. So often I didn't start by knowing this about snakes, but I kind of had a feeling that snake shedding, I lived for a summer in a house in Virginia that's up in the second floor was filled with shed skins of snakes. They go to high places and shed rub until their skins come off, and then they come back through your house. Not so much this far north. So I went and started reading about snakes, and a lot of this book is the result of my sensing that there was a correspondence and going back and reading and finding out, how do these things work? And I think this notion of letting go what's dear, I think about my mother and how hard that move was for her. Most of the people watching this are probably too young to grasp the iconic power of the plastic margarine container. But I think for women of my mother's generation, I mean, letting go of these things she had collected and would never use again, that's sloughing off. That especially knowing that on the other side of that change was recognizing that your life is no longer unlimited. And I think as human beings, that's very hard for us to, I guess I can say that myself as someone entering that part of my life. The French have this term, the troisième âge, the third age, which is like a little softer and thinking not about just spiraling off into the end, but entering another stage. But I think that, holding on, the urge to hold on, the reluctance to let go, the reluctance to recognize that we are in the hands of physical forces, biological forces, that we need to, that it might be better for us to come to terms with than to simply reject and push away. For me, I don't have, I don't, not by any means have a vast store of wisdom on what we're experiencing now with COVID. But for me, one of the things that's come out of this experience is realizing that, the modern idea that we can banish every illness, that we have the technology to beat back every challenge to the human body has obviously been proven untrue. And in fact, people aren't even willing to do that. So I think that's where that came from, that kind of instinct, that search for what I might call correspondences in the natural world, that's felt to me more recognizable than many of the things I knew from being a reader of human narratives.
I love that you say that you feel that those other than human beings were and are your partners in all this. That's really beautiful. And so I think that's what I find, and I would imagine others find so moving about this book, that it is about a certain kind of surrender, and that you chart that so precisely and so diligently, and with such distilled language. It feels like the language is stable in a certain way. It's hard to describe, but it's so different from that Franklin narrative of supremacy over our bodies, over nature, over our destiny. Right. And I was also, I think I told you, I was kind of scared reading about your experience in the hospital, because it was written so honestly and so vividly. And it definitely seemed like there was that you were looking at issues of identity in terms of who am I now? When
I first when I came out of the hospital the first time, I actually went to my rabbi to talk to her about the fact that I just didn't know how to recover who I had been. I mean, the moment when I was lying on a gurney in the basement of Mount Sinai, this was not something that was supposed to happen to me. One of the things that she recommended that I read was a very powerful memoir by a physician in Seattle who had had a terrible accident. I think it might be called Over My Head, the book. Anyway, she'd flipped over, she was a serious bicyclist. She'd flipped over the top of her bicycle when when a twig got caught in her wheel. She had a traumatic brain injury, and she went through about a year, much worse than I've been through in that respect. And she really had to come to terms with the fact that she was able to regain, most of her motor functions and a lot of her cognitive abilities, but she really couldn't be a physician anymore.
Mm.
And one of the things that reasons she recommended this is because I think that, I really couldn't be the same person anymore. I remember my doctor saying, this does not have to be your life now. And it hasn't been. But I think there's something very transformative about illness, about a serious illness. And I think for me, that's really what I meant by being immersed in the world's messiness, that's been a teacher for me, not pushing back against that so much and not trying to figure out a way to go back to exactly who I was before, but trying to figure out, who am I now? And, what has that taught me? I mean, it's hard to imagine anyone would volunteer for being ill, or especially a rare illness or chronic illness, but I don't know. I feel like it's also brought me into a place where I've been asked to engage with a set of questions that I wouldn't have engaged with otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I really do.
Beautiful.
So in that way, without, I think you can both have your experience deepened, without necessarily at the same time promising yourself a linear narrative that leads to success or, some kind of resolving illumination. Both those things I think can happen at the same time. And I think that illness I feel illness has asked me, and watching my mother's illness. And one thing I have learned from being ill is that everybody's sick differently. I think you hear that in the arguments over the terms like cancer survivor, and the way in which that puts cancer behind people, that everyone is ill in a different way. And I think that's one thing I hope the book also dramatizes, is that my mother and I were ill in very different ways.
It definitely does. Yeah, absolutely. So it feels like I felt throughout the book that you were learning, and I was learning more and more about what it is to live life, and what it is to face a slowly evolving crisis like your mother's decline, and then a quick crisis like yours where you don't have control.
Right.
You don't have control.
But I'm very glad to hear that's what you felt while you were reading.
Oh, absolutely. And also I really felt throughout what Keats called negative capability, is that you were willing to not have the kind of heightened illumination that answered everything, that you were willing to not know. And I does that inform your writing and your thinking about your writing now?
It's a great question. I think so. I think definitely, I think that I really was brought into the presence of a set of questions, listening to someone be told, some young doctor tell, an older woman, your life is basically over, you can go home to die, without putting it exactly like that. Am I thinking I really, want to just push this curtain aside and tell her this in a different way? I just don't know what the right way to do there aren't right answers in this situation. Listening to people being asked, could you evaluate your pain on a scale of 1 to 10, and you hear a 23-year-old say 11.
Just in the interest of time, I just want to break in, perhaps Professor Blatner, you might have one more question for Professor Jacobson. That's terrific. And then in a short while, we're going to turn our attention to questions that participants might have. Just a reminder for those who are participating in this session, please send me in the chat any questions you might have. And in a little while, we'll have Professor Jacobson address those as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think my last question has to do with gardening, and I know it's something that you've written about before, and it's something that seems to mean a lot to you and a lot to your mother, and it's at the end of the book, near the end of the book. It has an elegiac feeling to it, which is very beautiful. Can you say anything about how that kind of works in your consciousness?
So that is something, that's another example of something I've had to do research on, because I'm the only person in my family that's not a gardener. I know that that's been a very powerful experience for my mother, my father, my sister. And I have a sense that that's a place to find my mother, is in gardens. And just, very briefly, when my mother died, I grew up in Chicago. We sat Shiva for my mother in Chicago, and at the end of Shiva, I came back to New York and felt like I'd kind of left that behind. And so I made a commitment to myself at the beginning that for the Shloshim, I would go in my own observance. I would go for 30 days to a different garden every day and and just sit there and write whatever came to me. And so I had to research where are some of the really interesting gardens in New York. And I think for me that I'm coming back to that just now, actually, to figure out a way to write about that. But I think that for me is one of the most powerful connections, gardens, to the kind of hopefulness that was really central to my mother. And the sense that's inevitable in gardens, that the future lies ahead, that you have something to look forward to, that the world renews itself every season.
Beautiful, really beautiful. I just want to show people the book because it's a beautiful book, and it's a small book. It feels like a prayer book to me, actually, and it feels like the whole book is kind of a prayer, and I highly recommend it. So thank you. It's really lovely.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that compliment.
Yeah.
Big deal compliment.
Yes, thank you. Thank you to Professor Jacobson for being here, and to Professor Blatner for serving as discussant in such a an insightful way that has really helped to make this so meaningful. Taking a look now at questions that are coming in. Did coming to terms with your mortality, the questioner asks, happen before, after, or through your writing?
I'd have to say, I think that writing's I think the process of writing for me is very introspective. So I would say, again, I didn't start by saying, I feel for me is not the most deeply moving writing for me is not to start with a commitment to a theme, to a answer. And I was struck by what my mother had said to me. I'd written a number of essays about my mother for this project. This follows a memoir about growing up Jewish in the suburbs of Chicago, and afterwards my mother said, I hope you're not going to write about me again. So then I'd begun writing these essays. I'd written 3 or 4 of them. I hadn't showed them to her. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a bioethicist, and I said, how much longer do you think can I keep writing these essays without telling my mother? And I said, when do you think I should tell her? And she said, yesterday. So I showed them to my mom, and it was very powerful because my mom, kind of a little scary that she might say, you have to stop this, but luckily she didn't. But she did say to me, I think that these essays about me, meaning her, She said, I think that the sadness about mortality here is yours, not mine. She said, I don't think about mortality. I don't fear death. She said, I think you at your age, this is pressing on you in a way that it isn't for me. So I'm not sure that that's the full answer to that question. But I think if mortality also means thinking about death, I mean, I think without question that writing was a process for me of being present with that fear, without having to solve it for myself.
It's interesting that you mentioned that. I mean, I have seen also in works of psychology that surveys have suggested that younger people tend to fear death more so, certainly differently than might older people.
Yeah, I think I realized that my mother, I think I had been a lot more arrogant when I started writing this. I thought when I started writing about my mother that I understood her better than she did. And in some ways, writing is can be a very aggressive and dominating thing to do. You know, creating a story in which someone else is a character in which you place them. And I think one of the things I learned from this was that my mother at least knew emotionally what a friend of mine who's an ER doc and an essayist calls the emotional narrative. She knew a lot of things that I didn't realize she knew. And I knew less than I thought I knew.
If there are any questions that maybe someone wanted to present themselves, live, we haven't gotten any others in the chat, but maybe at this point we can open the floor if you want to, turn on your screen and join the conversation. Ronnie, you're muted, but go ahead, unmute.
Question dovetailing on what you just said. Was it hard to write about people, specifically your mother? I mean, you had that moral question that you asked your bioethicist friend. That was handy to have such an expert close by. Yes. But did that complicate? And was very struck by that term, admitting to how aggressive writing can be, right? As an act, as an ethical move. And it's very charged. Can you talk about that? It's something that amazes me about people who are able to write about their family. I can't directly.
So maybe it should be a harder process. I have to say this is very much struck me as a question when I've taught creative nonfiction and memoir writing and writing about illness at Yeshiva College, and I've learned so much from my students there. And that is that, most of us, this is what we know the best is our families. And I think it's a natural place for people to start writing. But then I think the hard part is, and I've seen this with so many students, realizing that your writing is not going to probably go very deep if you aren't willing to ask some questions that your parents might not be so comfortable with. The things that you feel strongly about, are probably going to be things where you go emotionally into a place that doesn't feel so comfortable, and I think that's often, I find with my students, the place where they shift to a different topic, because it really it's very hard to, separate, to use a word from psychology, from their parents in that way. So I guess for me, it has felt, there's a way in which, and this is, I think, goes back to this combination of arrogance and humility about being a writer. There is a way, I think, in retrospect, that my mother is my best developed character. I've written a lot about her. I think she's my brother-in-law said something interesting after reading my previous book, which was that my mother was the heroine of that book. And if there is a heroine here, that would be I think, my mother's will to survive. I think in another essay, I talk about the fact that at Pesach one year, as we went around the table and talked about the plagues of our time, my mother named lack of forgiveness as the plague of our time. And that kind of capaciousness of heart, I think, has been a character, that the character who, that character, that version of my mother, I think, is the one that dominates these narratives, not the version of my mother in which, you know, I go home to visit her in Chicago and we're about to go downstairs for dinner at the place she's living. And she looks at me and she says, "Are you planning to go downstairs with your hair looking like that?" That, you know, when you're in 60 and your mother's still saying that, that character doesn't appear here. It could, right? And but I think that is part of what, I mean, I think I look back and I see that the character, the mother whose heart is capacious in that way, the mother who says she doesn't think about dying. You know, I remember when we first brought hospice in, and this nurse went out to feed parking meter, and I said to my mother, "Are you afraid of dying?" And she said, "I'm not afraid of dying." She said, "I'm really afraid of being in pain." And I just think those I feel very lucky to have had those conversations. And, but I think that's a version of my mother that is my mother as character that has, that I've been able to create in these narratives, and that what I've left, that's what I've made of her. A few years ago, we did a program where different writers came to my class at YU, and one of them was Grace Paley, and one of the students asked her, "Are these the major," I forget, I hope I can remember now what the main character in her story, in almost all her stories, is called. Maybe she's called Grace, but anyway, I remember students saying, "Is this autobiographical? Is Grace you?" And she said, in the very Grace Paley-ish way, she said, "She's not me," she said, "but she works for me." And I guess in this sense, the mother that's here is a mother who works for, who I've made into a teacher in a sense. You know, there are other places where I'm impatient with her, you know, and where there's another essay about how my sister and I went to see a exhibition on jellyfish at the Shed Museum in Chicago, and we knew my mother would love to have gone with to that museum, to that show. And then as we talked about it, we realized we just didn't have the patience to go through what it would take to take her there. And I think those kinds of examples also, you know, are part of shedding light on myself.
At 1 o'clock, many of our students have shiurim or courses that they need to attend, so we do need to wind down at this point. Again, thank you, Professor Jacobson, for sharing with us. It really was such a special opportunity, and some are giving you their noiseless applause and virtual thank yous. And Professor Blatner, for all that you added and brought out, really was a special touch here. Thank you to Professor Prellis for partnering and
Eliezer, wonderful.
Thank you guys so much. This was really, I think you could see, a pleasure for me to have this discussion.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful, Joanne.
Thank you.
Wonderful to talk to you, as always.
Ditto.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good day.
Hi, Joanne.